What happens when a private affair inside the White House turns into a federal investigation? And what do you do when the evidence isn't hearsay but a physical object with presidential DNA? That's exactly what happened inside the White House in the mid-1990s. President Bill Clinton, then in his second term, began a secret relationship with a 22-year-old White House intern named Monica Lewinsky. Their encounters occurred in private rooms just steps from the Oval Office, some during working hours, some while the First Lady was elsewhere in the building. At first, it wasn't public knowledge, and there were no leaks and no eyewitness reports. But in 1998, it all unraveled. Lewinsky confided in a colleague, Linda Tripp, who had secretly recorded their conversations. The tapes revealed not just a relationship, but a cover-up. Tripp turned the tapes over to independent counsel Ken Starr, who was investigating Clinton on unrelated matters. Lewinsky had saved a blue dress with physical evidence. There were also voicemails, notes, and gifts from the president. Clinton, when questioned under oath, denied the relationship outright. The denial triggered the next phase. The House of Representatives charged Clinton with perjury and obstruction of justice. He was impeached in December 1998, only the second U.S. president ever to face that. Clinton later admitted to the relationship and survived impeachment, acquitted by the Senate in early 1999. He served out the remainder of his term, but the scandal reshaped his presidency and altered how the public viewed the office itself. It's a lasting example of how his personal behavior inside the White House, even behind closed doors, can trigger national consequences. In August 1814, during the War of 1812, British troops set fire to the White House, then known as the President's House, in what is one of the most direct and destructive foreign attacks on the executive mansion in U.S. history. It happened fast. On August 24th, British troops under Major General Robert Ross entered Washington, D.C. unopposed after defeating American troops at the Battle of Bladensburg. President James Madison had already fled the city. First Lady Dolly Madison, refusing to leave without securing important artifacts, famously ordered the rescue of Gilbert Stuart's portrait of George Washington, cutting it from the frame before escaping. That evening, British troops ate the meal laid out for the American president, then proceeded to torch the White House, the Capitol, and other federal buildings. The fire gutted the interior of the president's house. Its sandstone walls remained standing, but everything inside, furniture, drapes, records, books, and personal items, was destroyed. When Madison returned days later, the building was a shell. Reconstruction began almost immediately. Architect James Hoban, who had designed the original structure, was hired to lead the rebuilding effort. The exterior was preserved, but the inside had to be completely redone. Madison never lived in the restored building. James Monroe would become the first president to occupy the rebuilt White House in 1817. In early 1971, President Richard Nixon ordered the installation of a secret, sound-activated recording system in the Oval Office. It was a full setup. Sony TC-800B reel-to-reel recorders, hardwired to telephone and hidden microphones inside the Wilson desk and around the room. And Nixon didn't stop there. Over the next year, the system expanded to the cabinet room, his private office in the Executive Office Building, and multiple phone lines. The system captured over 3,700 hours of conversations, many without anyone in the room knowing they were being recorded. His goal? To build a personal archive, a record of decisions, deals, and diplomacy. But what he actually created was evidence. Some of the recordings captured Nixon discussing efforts to obstruct the FBI's investigation into the Watergate break-in. These tapes included what became known as the smoking gun tape, a conversation from June 23, 1972, just days after the break-in, where Nixon and Chief of Staff H.R. Haldeman discussed using the CIA to block the FBI's inquiry. The taping system's existence was exposed during Senate hearings in 1973, and suddenly the entire Nixon presidency was under forensic review. Subpoenas followed, and the White House resisted, citing executive privilege. But after a lengthy legal battle, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously that Nixon had to turn over the tapes. By August, the political support that had protected Nixon collapsed. He resigned on August 8, 1974, the only U.S. president to do so. A locked medical bag arrived at the White House multiple times a week. Inside was a cocktail of various illicit medications, prepared not by the White House medical unit, but by a private physician known as Dr. Feelgood. President John F. Kennedy was dealing with chronic back pain, digestive issues, and Addison's disease. His official doctors prescribed rest and a strict regimen. But in 1961, Kennedy began secret treatments with Dr. Max Jacobson, a New York physician who promised fast results through high-potency injections. At first, no one outside Kennedy's inner circle knew. Jacobson flew in under pseudonyms, met with the president privately, and flew out again. The injections kept coming, especially before press conferences, major speeches, and foreign trips. Soon, staff noticed changes. Kennedy's energy levels spiked and crashed. He sometimes appeared manic, then withdrawn. In Vienna, during the 1961 summit with Khrushchev, JFK was reportedly on Jacobson's injections the entire time. Jacobson's formula wasn't regulated. It included amphetamines, vitamins, animal hormones, and painkillers. The mix varied, and no logs were kept. White House physicians raised concerns. Jacobson was eventually banned from treating the president directly, but not before JFK had received dozens of injections. Meanwhile, Kennedy's private life inside the White House was equally compartmentalized. He had multiple affairs, including with White House staffers, actresses, and at least one woman with alleged mafia ties, often in the residence. Secret Service agents were instructed to manage access and silence. Lyndon B. Johnson used the White House like no other president in history. His leadership style was all about control and an almost complete disregard for personal boundaries. And when you live where you work, those boundaries can disappear altogether. His most unusual behaviors, including holding meetings from the bathroom and giving orders while undressed, were not occasional quirks, but part of his daily routine. Staffers and cabinet members were frequently summoned into the bathroom while Johnson was using it. He was doing the business of running the country while doing his business. According to aides like Jack Valenti and George Reedy, Johnson believed that traditional boundaries, like privacy or decorum, were inefficient obstacles to getting things done, and so he expected others to adapt. Johnson's antics weren't limited to the inside of the bathroom. He also often dictated memos or issued instructions while changing clothes, immediately after showering, or while in a bathrobe. These moments reflected his belief that the presidency demanded constant attention, regardless of setting. No president before or since has used the White House quite the way Johnson did. How did the White House become the scene of secret poker games and illegal booze? And how did one president turn the executive residence into a private speakeasy during Prohibition? That's exactly what happened during the 1920s under President Warren G. Harding. While Americans faced arrest for a glass of wine, the second floor of the White House hosted all-night poker games stocked with bootleg whiskey, cigars, and political insiders. But when Harding's friends and cabinet members showed up with contraband in hand, the games weren't just outrageous, they revealed how the president's own actions defied the very laws his administration was supposed to enforce. Harding's poker cabinet included close allies and possibly oil executives and members of the infamous Ohio Gang. They played cards in the Yellow Oval Room, part of the private residence, where they drank freely and traded influence behind closed doors. So how did this happen? Well, Harding saw Prohibition as a necessary compromise to appease voters, not a rule he personally valued. One reason it continued unchecked was location. The Yellow Oval Room, tucked away in the executive quarters, offered privacy from press and staff. No one outside the inner circle had access. Why would the First Lady of the United States invite psychics into the executive mansion? And how did spiritualism become part of life during America's most brutal war? That's precisely what unfolded inside the White House in the 1860s. The country was fractured by civil war, casualties mounted, and in 1862, Abraham and Mary Lincoln's 11-year-old son, Willie, lost his life to typhoid. Mary Lincoln never recovered from the loss, and that's when the séances began. Mary began hosting spiritualist gatherings inside the White House. They took place in the Red Room or the upstairs private quarters. Mediums were brought in to help her communicate with her past son, Willie. She described seeing him standing by her bedside, smiling, with his hair parted just as it had been in life. At least one séance was attended by President Lincoln himself. According to contemporary accounts, he listened quietly as a medium claimed to channel spirits, possibly including those of fallen soldiers. Mary also held séances at nearby homes and brought back what she learned to the White House. So, what made it possible? Spiritualism was surging in popularity during the 19th century. Grief from the war gave it momentum. Mary had already been interested before Willie's death. Now it became personal. One factor that made the practice socially viable was privacy. Few people outside the Lincoln circle knew it was happening. The press didn't report it at the time. Even some of Lincoln's advisors were unaware. But the records exist in letters, diaries, and first-hand accounts. The séances themselves didn't impact policy, but they shaped the private world of the Lincoln White House. After Mary's mental health worsened in later years, critics would point to those spiritualist sessions as a sign of instability. Tucked inside a desk drawer in the White House sat a loaded revolver. The presence of a firearm inside the executive mansion wasn't just for show, and it wasn't part of any formal security plan, but it was ready to use. It began after March 30th, 1981, just 69 days into Ronald Reagan's presidency, when a would-be assassin fired 6 shots outside the Washington Hilton. One bullet hit Reagan under the arm, narrowly missing his heart. He nearly lost his life on the operating table. After the shooting, the Secret Service increased perimeter security and restricted access. But Reagan made his own adjustments. He started keeping a loaded .38 caliber revolver nearby, inside the White House. Questions arose years later. Why would a man constantly surrounded by armed agents feel the need to carry his own weapon? Was it fear, habit, symbolism? It did suit Reagan's lifelong belief in self-reliance and pointed to his Hollywood past where he had played lawmen, cowboys, and soldiers for decades. Years later, former advisor Martin Anderson confirmed that Reagan had, in fact, kept a loaded pistol within reach. No shots were ever fired and the weapon was never drawn in anger, but it was there, ready, and just steps from the nuclear codes. Between 1901 and 1909, the White House housed more than just a president. It hosted a rotating cast of creatures, some domestic, others not, brought in by Theodore Roosevelt's children, often without warning. Roosevelt had 6 children, and his approach to parenting was famously hands-off. The result was a White House that sometimes resembled a small zoo. Official records and first-hand accounts from staff, visitors, and journalists describe a constant shifting menagerie. Dogs, cats, guinea pigs, a badger named Josiah, a hyena, a one-legged rooster, a parrot, and a small black bear named Jonathan Edwards. The chaos wasn't contained to the private quarters. The Roosevelt children regularly allowed their animals to roam public spaces. Quentin Roosevelt famously carried a snake named Emily Spinach in his pocket and once released it during a formal reception. Guests fled and staff scrambled. No one had planned for snake protocol. On another occasion, Archie Roosevelt fell ill upstairs. His brother brought the family pony, Algonquin, into the White House, rode the elevator to the 2nd floor, and delivered the animal to his bedside. No one stopped him. Multiple reports describe the sound of hooves on hardwood floors, animal droppings in reception rooms, and startled foreign dignitaries avoiding certain corridors. Despite the frequent disruption, Roosevelt refused to reprimand his children or limit their pets. In fact, he celebrated their curiosity and energy. When a reporter asked about the animals, Roosevelt brushed it off as good fun. When Andrew Jackson was inaugurated as the seventh President of the United States on March 4, 1829, he brought with him a wave of populist energy that had never before reached the White House. What followed that day remains one of the most chaotic moments in presidential history. After taking the oath of office, Jackson returned to the White House for what was supposed to be a public reception. Traditionally, these events were small, formal, and carefully managed. Jackson broke with precedent by opening the doors to the general public, not just elite guests, but ordinary citizens, supporters, and curious onlookers. Within hours, thousands of people crowded into the White House. Men climbed through windows to get in. Women stood on furniture to get a better view of the president. Guests tracked mud across polished floors, knocked over fine china, and climbed on silk-covered chairs with dirty boots. Furniture was smashed and glassware was broken. At one point, Jackson himself was said to be pinned against a wall by the crowd and had to escape out a side door or window while the crush of people continued. To clear the building, White House staff reportedly set out large tubs of punch and whiskey on the south lawn, hoping the crowd would follow the drinks outside. It worked. Partly. The scene shocked the political establishment in Washington. The event earned nicknames like the Mob Scene and the People's Day. How does a young soldier steal a military helicopter, fly it undetected through restricted airspace, and land it on the White House lawn? And more importantly, how did security fail at every level without anyone stopping him? That's exactly what happened in Washington, D.C. in 1974. 20-year-old Robert Preston, an Army helicopter mechanic who'd washed out of flight school, took off in a stolen Bell UH-1 Iroquois from Tipton Army Airfield in Maryland. He wasn't trying to escape, protest, or harm anyone. He just wanted to prove he could fly. But when he headed toward the most restricted airspace in the country, things escalated fast. The White House itself was unprepared. Preston circled the Washington Monument, buzzed the Lincoln Memorial, and dropped onto the South Lawn without immediate interference. Secret Service agents panicked. He lifted off again, hovered over the executive mansion, and returned for a second landing. During his second landing attempt, the Secret Service opened fire, wounding him and forcing him to land. The problem wasn't just the breach, it was how effortless it was. There was no airspace alarms, and initial pursuit was ineffective, with a slow police helicopter unable to keep up. And on top of that, no anti-air defenses were activated. Army response came only after flights over high-security zones, including a return trip to the White House. So what happened? The White House airspace had been designated as restricted, but enforcement relied almost entirely on radar monitoring and assumptions that no one would dare. Security protocols had not adapted to low-altitude threats from small aircraft. Preston simply slipped through the gaps. Despite the fact that he wasn't trying to hurt anyone, he was arrested and charged with wrongful appropriation and breach of the peace. He served 6 months in jail. The military reviewed base security, and the Secret Service quietly overhauled airspace response protocols. No such breach has ever been repeated. A small plastic bag was discovered in a cubby near the West Wing's West Executive Entrance, an area used by staff, visitors, and even Secret Service. Inside the bag was less than a gram of a white, powdery, illegal stimulant. The building was immediately locked down. Hazmat teams were called in. Initial fears pointed to a chemical or biohazard. It wasn't. The white powder was tested and identified, and it wasn't Pepsi. It was the other one. The Secret Service launched an investigation because the location was just steps from the Situation Room and routinely accessed by White House staff and cleared guests. Surveillance footage was reviewed and entry logs were analyzed, and dozens of personnel were questioned. But within days, the investigation was closed. No fingerprints, no suspect, no disciplinary action. And that raised questions. How did an illegal narcotic make it through one of the most secure buildings in the world? Why were no cameras directly monitoring the cubby area? And why was the case dropped so quickly? Some blamed a high-traffic weekend. It was just after July 4th, and visitors, including VIP guests, had come and gone. Others pointed to gaps in White House screening procedures. Anonymous officials said the bag had likely been there for a short period, but they couldn't confirm whose it was. One key factor was the location. It wasn't inside the Oval Office or a secure SCIF, but just outside the West Wing, near an area used for drop-offs and cell phone storage. That allowed the White House to downplay the incident, but they couldn't confirm whose it was. Thank you for watching the video and making it to the end. What's your take on these insane things that went down in the White House? What outrageous happenings do you think we might have coming up? We'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you liked the video, please give us a like. It really helps the channel. And to get notified when we have a new video coming up, hit the subscribe button. In fact, there should be a video on your screen right now that YouTube thinks you might like, so check it out. Thanks again. See you next time.